Morning.
Good morning.
Let's begin with the crisis facing the Labour Party. Your close friend, political ally Angela Rayner has said that the party needs to fight or die. Is it that serious? Does the party face extinction?
That's right. We've just suffered one of our worst electoral defeats on record, and I don't think we can underestimate the impact that has on the party and the amount of work that needs to be done. And it's quite clear that we can't carry on as we were before, but we need to recognise the reasons for that defeat. There were a number of reasons as to why we lost trust in our communities. Brexit was one. We weren't trusted on Brexit. We weren't trusted as a party to tackle the crisis of anti-Semitism. We weren't trusted on our policies, no matter how radical or detailed they were. They simply didn't hit the ground running in many of our communities in terms of demonstrating that economic credibility. And we struggled to get out what I term as a coherent narrative and a real strategy throughout that campaign. And many of the very positive elements of the manifesto, which we knew had scored very highly in polling before, such as industrial strategy, a green industrial revolution, they really weren't pushed to the extent that they should have been.
OK, you've named a number of factors there. Interesting, including ones which aren't in your Tribune article, like Brexit, like anti-Semitism. But you don't talk about Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, which many of the people who lost say came up again and again on the doorstep.
Of course it did. And, you know, Jeremy had suffered unprecedented levels of criticism and attack against his own personal character. And he was very resilient throughout. I supported Jeremy. I still support Jeremy because I felt that he was the right man with the right moral integrity to lead the party and the right ideas.
Didn't he? Doesn't he accept responsibility for that?
Of course he does.
Purely media
Of course he does. And any leader who leads us into a general election defeat needs to take ultimate responsibility. But he also set out a radical platform for policy development that involved the grassroots and our trade unions and developed some of the most exciting and innovative policies that we've seen in a generation. And I think he'll go down in history as being remembered as the leader that has done that.
You attacked the party's policy on Brexit. Did you do that when you were a member of the Shadow Cabinet?
I certainly did. And we were in a very difficult position in our party, and everybody recognises that. Those who were in Leave communities like myself repeatedly stated that we were concerned about veering away from focusing on getting a good deal and moving towards a people's vote or a second referendum. But we also recognised the damage that could be caused in those communities who voted Remain, who wanted us to take a more robust stance.
So you ended up with what some people characterise as a fudge.
We did. We ended up with a compromise solution, quite frankly, and it was very clear in the election campaign that it did not satisfy. And despite all of our attempts to explain the prospect and the damaging consequences of no deal, despite our attempts to say that we were attempting to give people the final choice to have their say on the deal, it really wasn't resonating.
So was Keir Starmer wrong then to push for another referendum?
Keir Starmer and other members of the Shadow Cabinet, and indeed our members, were trying to reach a solution that would unify our party and unify our communities. And there were risks involved with taking either a more pro-Remain or a pro-deal stance, if you like, and that's appreciated. But my concern, certainly from where I'm from in Salford, was that we were losing trust with our communities who voted Leave because they were very clear in that they wanted the Brexit issue resolved as quickly as possible. And whilst we triangulated and we focused on our parliamentary processes and manoeuvrings, and we were right to do that, by the way, to take no deal off the table, we often took our eye off the ball in developing that coherent argument that resonated really.
You're actually right that the party was wrong by turning our focus inwards on parliamentary manoeuvring for the last year. I mean, that is a covert attack on Keir Starmer, who was trying to stop Brexit.
It's certainly not a covert attack. What would say is that we did spend an inordinate amount of time on those parliamentary manoeuvrings, making sure that we were taking no deal off the table. And we took our eye off the ball in developing our argument within our communities. When I knocked on a Remain voter's door, they thought we were a Leave party. When I vote on a Leave voter's door, they thought that we were a Remain party. So it was quite clear that everything that we were trying to say in the media was confusing to voters.
So what would have ended that confusion? Become a pro-Leave party?
Not a pro-Leave party. I mean, I was very focused on making the point that we were trying to get a good deal. And I think that should have been a very strong message in everything that we'd said. And it was quite clear that, you know, people had passionate views right across the spectrum and they were right to do that. But often that caused confusion in our campaign.
Did Jeremy Corbyn himself get anything wrong? Did he get it wrong on anti-Semitism?
We weren't strong enough on anti-Semitism, and I've been quite clear about that before. I think that we have made...
But did Jeremy Corbyn himself get that wrong?
Well, he ultimately has to take responsibility as the leader of the party. He has to lead, and I think he has apologised, and there are things that should have happened far quicker. We should have sped up our processes. We should have listened to Jewish communal organisations and involved them, and now we're in a situation where trust has been completely broken, and the new leader, whether that's myself or any of the other candidates, has to rebuild that trust very quickly, and we have to make robust proposals. Some of the things that I've talked about previously were quite clear, and I'd hope all the candidates were quite clear that we have to adopt all of the recommendations of the EHRC when they come back shortly. An independent process is also something that needs to be strongly considered.
Were you arguing for all of this behind the scenes at the time?
I was indeed, yes.
Let's look at some of the policies that you yourself would advocate. You're critical of the Labour Party putting a slogan on mugs which read "No controls on immigration." Does that mean that you actually believe in no immigration controls?
I think we need to have a fair immigration system, but we can't nod towards quite dangerous politics. And I understand the reasons why that was done in the election campaign. And there are concerns, certainly within our party, that there are, elements that concern people about immigration policy within our community. But we do need, as a party, to make a stronger argument, because I don't think we've ever set out the economic case as to why immigration is a positive force for our country.
I've heard many Labour politicians making that case, probably in the past 4 elections, actually. But when it comes to the kind of people who were tribally Labour, traditionally Labour, lots of them voted Brexit on the issue of immigration, and they want to know what your policy is going to be. And a fair immigration policy doesn't spell out very much. Do you want more controls or uncontrolled immigration?
Well, many people within our communities who may have voted on that basis voted because they were under the impression that their local economy and their lives were detrimented by an influx of so-called migrants. Now, that just isn't the case. I have not seen any economic evidence to suggest that the influx of workers from any country across the world at the moment has depressed wages in any way. It is true that, and we've talked about the undercutting of workers' wages through policies that were implemented through the EU, and the Labour Party has been clear about changing the position on that. But we've also got to recognise the positive impact that immigration has on our NHS and our businesses, and how it's necessary to have that skill set and to bring people into the country to help our economy going forward.
So do you believe in freedom of movement?
This is the million-dollar question. We are leaving the European Union at the moment, so the premise of freedom of movement will end effectively. So whether we like freedom of movement or not, we're going to have a discussion within Parliament and within our party about what replaces that and what a fair immigration
system looks like. A million-dollar question that I'm asking you, because you want to be the next Prime Minister. What do you think, should the freedom of movement that happened in this country under the EU, should it continue?
I certainly think that those EU residents that are here at the moment need to be given the assurance that they need to stay here. But I also know that we all need to have immigration to serve our economic needs. One of the key factors that came up right throughout the Brexit discussions in the conversations that I had with businesses was the concerns that they had about not being able to source the necessary skills quickly enough. And that's where freedom of movement assisted them. They could get the right people in very, very quickly and support their growing businesses, and that's necessary to ensure that we have that functioning economy going forward.
You've talked in the past about progressive patriotism, and I wanted to explore a little bit about what that means. Would that mean, if necessary, that you would push the nuclear button?
In terms of what I was alluding to in my article that I wrote over Christmas, is that, we always talk about patriotism. Jeremy talked about patriotism before Christmas, about it being a need to support people within our communities. I've highlighted that right throughout our travels on our election campaign, there was one thing that became very, very clear, and that was people's sense of pride in their communities, where they lived, in their local institutions, in their lives.
And some of them may include a strong defence policy on that, and we want to know whether you'll be prepared to use our nuclear deterrent.
Any leader and any Prime Minister has to be very clear that the security and the protection of the people that they represent comes first above all else, and they would do anything that it takes to ensure that the people of this country are protected, and I'll be very clear on that.
Include using the deterrent, to be clear.
I think, well, if you have a deterrent, you have to be prepared to use it. But I'm not going to, be a warmonger and foaming at the mouth and saying that I'm going to press a button, because any leader needs to ensure that they assess the situation, they address the consequences of their actions. And of course, any country that was considering on pushing the nuclear button needed to realise that we were facing nuclear annihilation right across the whole world. But yes, a leader would need to be prepared to engage in that if they were going to use the nuclear deterrent going forward.
Now, you're going to get an awful lot more focus on you as a leadership candidate, different from being Shadow Business Secretary, however high profile you've had in the past. You've talked about your childhood in an election leaflet. This was reported in the Sunday Times. You said that my dad, Jimmy, worked on Salford docks, and I grew up watching him worrying when round after round of redundancies were inflicted on the docks. But the paper says you would have only been 2 when the docks were closed.
Oh, do you know, that's rubbish. I think people are scraping the barrel. My dad worked for Shell Barton Docks, which is a dock in Salford, and that closed approximately around the late 80s. And unfortunately, we were forced to move as a family because my dad needed to move to a new place of work, Ellesmere Port, Shell there. And he did face round after round of redundancies. And as a trade union representative, I remember I was always quite nosy as a child, and I used to sit at the top of the stairs when my dad came home from shifts and listen to what him and my mum were talking about. And one particular incident stuck in my mind where he came home and he was in tears because he was sitting in a room that looked at the oil tankers being filled up on cameras, and it was the same exit that workers used to leave the premises. And he knew that redundancy consultations and discussions were happening, and he was forced as the trade union rep to sit in that room and watch colleague after colleague walk out of the building with a bin liner full of stuff from their lockers. And he knew that his role to protect them as a trade union organiser and representative hadn't been fulfilled, and he was absolutely devastated by that.
So that's clearly shaped your own political philosophy. But what about you as a person? People don't know very much about you. I mean, for example, what last made you laugh out loud?
Well, last made probably Angela Rayner. She's always coming out with cracking jokes.
Not her manifesto for deputy leader, I trust. She went
No, it's a brilliant manifesto for deputy leader.
Could she have stood for leader?
Of course she could. Angela Rayner is a superstar, and I would back her 100% whatever she wanted to do in the future.
Rebecca Long-Bailey, thank you for talking to us.
Thanks very much.